of course, this kind of knowledge, this kind of savoirs, as Foucault said, have relevant consequences in terms of the practices of head teachers, but of course also in terms of, for example, selection policies, training recruitment policies, promotion for careers, the possibility to look at the merit pay, just as in other organizations. And the most part of this kind of policy are always stressing personal super qualities, which are inherent to the human characteristic of the leader. So, of course, depending from the main characteristic of the approach, you could stress super qualities that could be trained or super qualities that could be envisaged from the origin, from the birth of a single man or woman. It is very well located, I think, in the eugenetic climate depicted by some scholars. And of course, as has been noticed by Niche in a book on Foucault and education, this kind of dominant paradigms implies that a critical self-reflection of leadership needs to be seriously questioned. So, is it possible to deconstruct this kind of paradigms, this kind of idea? It is possible to look at what it means to conceive of leadership as entrepreneurs of themselves, just as for all the neoliberal subjects as depicted, for example, in human capital theory and so on. And I think it is very interesting to notice how critical leadership studies have developed during the last 2 decades. And for example, a very symptom of this kind of reaction to the dominant paradigm has been the absence of a chapter on leadership, on educational leadership, in the handbook from Apple, Ball, and Gandin, which has been very recently edited. But in terms of conception and research, it means a lot of other things. For example, as I quoted before, in the perspective of an ontology of practice, Mike Spillane, who is the most important, I could say, scholar, which has dedicated a lot of research and studies to the idea of distribution of leadership. They, referring to the activity system theory from Engstrom, which has a very strong link with the conception of Vygotsky, the psychologist Vygotsky, which is very focused on social praxis, they tend to produce, thanks to their research, very thick description, not on the surface of the life of the school life, but very thick description, ethnographic description, I should say that usually when they represent this kind of model, they put together diverse triangles, trying to depict how it is necessary to have a thick description prolonged along the years. So you need to stay for a lot of times in a school to understand which kind of leadership is effectively distributed. And in this case, I think that what is also very important, it is that there is no causal relationship between leaders, followers, situation, maybe also the materiality of context. This is another hypothesis. This one is another hypothesis from a critical perspective. Thanks to Woods. He is proposing an idea of democratic leadership, but this is a very simplified version of this model, but as you can see, it implies a diachronical conception of the relation between what is being called structure, but it implies also the culture of schools, the social roles, the social context, the social meanings, and so on, in relation with the persons, with the role of the persons. And what is important is trying to explore the kind of engagement, the kind of interrelationship between the person and the structure. So what is important is this kind of ontology of praxis. I should say that because this kind of conception is strictly related to critical realism, in a certain way there is a strong difference, for example, with Foucauldian perspective, because in this case, from a very sociological point of view, they try to stress the distinction or to avoid conflation between the role of the structures and the role of the actors. In the case, for example, of Margaret Archer's conception of this kind of interpretation, which is called a morphogenetic interpretation of the structure. She is very interested in the exploration of the role of reflexivity of the social actors. So in this case, for example, of the leaders or other educational subjects. And again and again, it is not conceivable to think of this kind of social model practicing research or evaluation, for example, policies with the other kind of ontology. And another, and I'm just in the end of the presentation, it is possible to think of leadership without leadership. Very recently, Ellen Gunter has proposed the idea of leadership as imbricated into discursive formation and educational context, looking especially at research conducted by Stephen Ball and his colleagues. The first one I will show you is a conception which sees leadership as a role of key biographies that enacts as catalyst in the enactment, in the proposition and application of policy reform. And thanks to diverse ethnographies they've conducted in schools, they have explored, for example, how the leadership have tried to, let's say, move itself between competing discursive or regimes of truth in educational policies. So they have tried to stress how a welfarist language and a new managerial language have influences about the market position, but even on the market conception of the social ensemble of a single school. So what does it mean to behave, to enact educational reform in thinking of a competition between schools, between students, between teachers, and so on? And the other idea is to look at the enactment of policies, taking very seriously the context as a main dimension to be explored. And in this sense, they continue to stress how leadership could be a mediator, could be a way of interpreting education policies as catalyst, as in trying to codify and recodify text, discourses, and education policies. And in this case, what has been stressed by Bolle and colleagues, it is also the creative roles of social actors in a way to translating the codification made of educational policies by text and discourses and so on, rules of different kinds, in the production of the reality of the school life. So, which means the difference between policy text, for example, and school text, in terms, for example, of disciplining the students' behavior in a certain way. So, going to the end. This kind of research, I think that gives a clear idea of what could be conceived in leadership as in terms of a dispositive, in terms of a leadership configuration, in terms of contextual configuration, trying to explore very deeply in a very sophisticated way, not in terms of methodological sophistication, measurement, but in terms of prolonged times of explorations in the school lives, and then trying to conceive how it is possible to explore the openness of this kind of ontology of practices, how they produce fractures, how they produce emergencies, how they open spaces for creativity and resistance, and how it is possible that someone could practice this kind of spaces of resistance and creativity. And just to end, this is the map they have produced about leadership, looking at the leadership life in schools, through ethnographies conducted in 4 or 5 schools, I don't remember, for more than a year. And as you can see, there is no space for leaders or leadership. This is a messy figure in a certain way, a messy map. You could find a lot of dimension, a lot of elements. And as they say in their book, how schools do policy enactment. I say they, in a very provocative way, they say, add what you like, delete what do you like, stressing the importance of being very well concerned about this kind of ontology. What it is important, it is not the single dimension, but it is how the praxis enact some dimension or others of the school of lives. And I would like to, for example, instead of speaking of leaders, they have tried to map different features of different roles. But it could happen that at the same time, I am a head teacher could act as a translator, as an enthusiast, as a critic, or maybe even a text or a curriculum could be interpreted in terms of roles, in terms of this kind of enacting education policy. Sorry. Okay. Well, this kind of conception, as I told you before, could be conceived of a paradoxical without leadership approach to leadership. And coming back to our question, I think that some of the answers could be depicted in this way. How do discursive formation arise? Thanks to governmentality practices, and not only discursive ones. which is a way to misunderstand the conception of discourse of Foucault. What are the epistemic premises? Individualism and rationalism, and of course it implies a lot in terms of the main conception as highlighted this morning by Emiliano, which kind of subjectivated encapsulates the teachers through this kind of reform, especially as levers of neoliberal reform. What freedom can be practiced, and I think this is very important because in this kind we are always pressured to act as self-entrepreneurs, but in enacting our self-entrepreneurship, we could also discover spaces of resistance and of freedom, not of liberation, of course, because in a Foucauldian conception, we could never be liberated from the power itself. And the other two questions, which are which kind of space for ethical choices, of course, through other regimes or through and other governmentality practices. And for example, my simple way to practice research in a mainstreaming trend was a way to practice another regimes or true, try to depict what happens in understanding the school life, conceiving of school lives in terms of single variables and single attitude variables and causation and linear causation. And the last one is, of course, the way we could try to enact other subjectivities. In this way, we could think about the idea of subjectivation as a way to practice freedom instead of being subjected to the pressure of education policies. But I think that in this at this moment it is not very important. And well, thank you. I've been almost